Hi everyone. I was recently inspired to work the Vienna game into my repertoire after watching a video by Levi Rosman. I'll link that video in the description below, and it's well worth checking out. So let's look at some of the theory behind the Vienna game, and then we'll look at some games that I was able to play in the last couple of days, and we'll look at some Grandmaster games as well. So the Vienna game is e4, e5, and knight c3. So white delays the development of his kingside knight in order to keep his f-pawn mobile. He might push it to f4 and play something that looks like a delayed king's gambit to me. So let's look at a few different moves here by black. One possible move is knight to f6, and if black plays that, then what we're going to do is play the Vienna Gambit and play f4 right away. Now black can decline the gambit with something like d6, and then you can just develop naturally, get your light squared bishop outside of your pawn chain, and white's looking really good here with that f-pawn on f4 helping attack the center. So something like that is normal in the Vienna game. Another way to decline this gambit and the main line is to play d5. And the point of that is after taking on e5, black has just secured a square here on e4 for his knight. And the main moves here are either d3 or knight to f3, but Levi Rosman recommends queen to f3, and that's what I tried in a game or two that I played. And you're threatening the knight here on e4, you're threatening to win a pawn. So black normally takes and ditches the knight, and you can take back with either the b or the d pawn. I prefer the d pawn and just get quick piece play. It's important to realize that this queen sometimes slides over to g3 to put pressure on g7 and to support your central pawn and to open up that square for your knight. So that's something worth remembering. Another thing worth remembering is if black develops this knight with your queen on f3, then it's threatening to come here or here and attack your queen, so I recommend just pinning it right away, and if black unpins, you take it off the board. Okay, so that's the Vienna Gambit. Another way black can play is something called the three knights variation, which runs like this: knight c6, so we play bishop c4 there, and knight f6. So this is called the three knights variation, and here you play d3, just open up the diagonal for your dark squared bishop, and black can choose various moves here like bishop c5, bishop b4, or it looks like grandmasters like to go for the bishop pair here with knight a5. That's another plan for black. I think the opponents around my rating level like this move bishop c5, hitting this weak f2 square. And in that case, I decided after looking at the database and trying this out with the engine that I just don't like the lines with f4 in this particular variation. So I tried bishop e3 here with the idea that if black takes, then I can use the open f file here, and that pawn does support my d4 square. You can play differently here. For example, if you play f4, you do have to watch out for black getting some kingside play here. I tried this against the engine, and the engine went d6, so the bishop and knight are both pointed at the g4 square. I played knight f3, the engine played here and attacked that square, and I decided to defend with the rook, hoping to castle queenside, but then I was shocked by this tactic, which is worth knowing about. The engine played knight takes h2, and the point is if I take back, then the engine has this fork and gets the piece back and is doing really well. So I just didn't like a lot of the lines with f4, so I decided to go for this move here. You can also play just knight f3, and this transposes into like a Gioco pianissimo type of position, so that's another option. Okay, and another way to play that is exciting if you get an opponent that tries it is bishop to c5, playing this symmetric type of position. Lead chess calls this the Mox Launch Defense. And a great move here is queen to g4 as recommended by Levi Rosman. And it's a dangerous move. The queen is pointed at the g7 square. The engine suggests defending g7 with one of two moves, either playing g6, which I would be happy to face because it just created a lot of dark squared weaknesses, or even king f8 as recommended by the engine. And if your opponent does that, you got to be happy with the opening. And the engine even recommends bishop to f8 here. And if you see that retreat, you also have to be very happy with the opening. But the engine does not at all recommend what most players play in this position. Most of us amateurs like this move, queen to f6, and it's hard to resist that move because it not only defends the square here on g7 and doesn't create those dark squared weaknesses, but it also threatens a check here on f2. Well, it turns out to be probably the worst defense in this position, and Levy says white's just winning after knight to d5. He's probably right. The engine says this is like plus 0.9, which is not exactly winning, but you'd have to play like an engine, I think, to withstand all the threats that white is throwing at black in the position. The point is, if black takes here on f2 with check, there's no follow-up. The f1 square is defended by your bishop, and that queen is precarious on that square. White has a lot of threats. He's still threatening queen takes g7. He's threatening knight takes c7, forking. Knight to h3 is a move black has to worry about since the queen is very light on squares. For example, if black plays something like king to f8 here to defend, you can play knight h3, the queen has to go back, which attacks your bishop. You can support the bishop, and then you're threatening to win the queen with c3. It is worth pointing out that if you get attacked, you might want to keep your queen on the g file, because if black opens up this diagonal, he might get in this check, and if you're not watching out for that, it could be disaster. Okay, but white is just up 7.5 in this position. So this is a very dangerous opening here. If black plays this symmetric defense, this Mox Launch Defense as it's called, play queen g4, and you're going to catch a lot of people in this opening in some traps. All right, one other thing I'll say about the Vienna game is I did have somebody play f5 against me, which looks weird. It's like black is trying to play King's Gambit, but down a tempo. And I just say take it. You know, Queen's Gambit accepted is already fine for black. It's probably the correct way to play against the King's Gambit. When white plays the King's Gambit, it's the correct way for black to respond. So it must be even better if you have this knight already developed on c3. And yeah, I did get a really good game after capturing on f5. All right, so let's take a look at some games. So here's one I played. So my opponent chose this 3 knights variation. So I played d3, and he did play bishop c5, and I had prepared this move bishop to e3. But he didn't take, he played d6. And since he just opened his light squared bishop, he has 2 minor pieces pointed here. I didn't want his knight coming here harassing my dark squared bishop, so I just played this prophylactic move h3. My opponent played a6, maybe intending to expand with b5, and maybe even b4 after that. But I played knight f3, just developing, getting ready to castle, and my opponent castled, and as soon as he did, I realized maybe I should pin the knight, and I re-diverted my bishop to a new diagonal here. And pinning that knight looked really good to me because there's no way for him to easily unpin the knight. I mean, his bishop is already outside of the pawn chain here. In fact, what my opponent did was kind of a disaster for him. He tried unpinning the knight with h6 and g5. That's sometimes possible to do if you haven't castled, but if you've already castled, it often runs into this mess. I played knight takes g5, and then I still have the knight pinned, and black is in a lot of trouble here. Although if black plays like an engine, he can play this just fine. In fact, the engine says this is negative 0.4, so black has a slight advantage. But it's very hard to play. White gets a lot of pressure on black. Black tries king to g7 to support the knight, since, you know, some attackers are coming in here, and that knight is pinned to the queen, so black is in a lot of danger. I played knight d5, attacking it again, and my opponent made the best move according to the engine. Bishop takes f2 check. And it says the position is about equal here, and I blunder with king to f1. And it's a really subtle blunder. And I forgive myself because it's just a blitz game. But the point is, this king and queen are aligned for a fork after knight takes d5, giving up the queen, forking, taking the bishop, taking the queen, taking the knight, taking the bishop, and black just remains up a piece in that line. So king to f1 was wrong there. The engine says just take the bishop, and then black gets this position here with equal material. And it's equal chances. Both kings are pretty badly placed. So that was the way to play, just take the bishop. Another possibility was to play here, but then black has knight to d4 check, inducing me to take the bishop anyway, and then running into this tactic again. Okay, but luckily, after I played this mistake, this blunder king f1, my opponent didn't see it. He didn't see this knight takes d5. I don't blame him. It's a 5-minute game. Instead, he just moves his bishop out of the way and loses the game quickly. Bishop takes f6, forks the king and queen. Queen takes back. I take the queen. He takes the knight. And now I'm going to win his bishop as well with this fork and then this attack. And my opponent resigned in this position. And so it's a very, very fun opening with a lot of explosive tactics, and you can beat some good players. This opponent of mine was higher rated than me. He was over 2,000 in Blitz on chess.com. So it was a satisfying win. Let's take a look at another game I played. Now here we played the Vienna Gambit. And my opponent does go for the main line, and I do get my queen onto f3 as recommended. So he captures on c3, and I take with my d pawn. Bishop c5, and here the engine says I should just be playing queen to g3, putting pressure here and supporting that pawn and releasing the square for the knight. But I didn't make that move. I played this opening suboptimally. I played bishop d3, h5, knight h3, then the bishop comes, and I move over, and we trade bishops here. Knight to c6, attacking the e5 pawn for a second time. So I pin the knight, he castles out of the pin, I take the bishop, I take the knight with my bishop, and I don't have time to take on a7 because the e5 pawn falls with check. So I play knight f2, attacking his bishop. He plays d4, I take, and then he calls check. Now here the engine says white is just doing really well, plus 2.4 if I find the correct response, which is c3. And I did not find that move, and the point is, if he takes on b2, white simply castles and everything else is defended, and black's king is terrible compared to white's king. White's going to get a rook on the b file, and white is up plus 2.4 according to the engine. Instead, I played queen to c3, and this just drops the d pawn. And then I exchanged minor pieces, castled short, and we played this rook and pawn endgame, probably with several mistakes. And eventually, I do get a small advantage right here. The engine says I'm up about plus 1.5, and then my opponent ran out of time. Okay, but it was good experience in the opening. Not a well-played game, but still I learned something. And then here's a third game I played yesterday, and we played this Mox Launch variation, this symmetric variation. And I got in this move, Queen G4, and I was happy to see Queen F6. And I knew there were going to be some explosive tactics. I played Knight D5, and he does take the pawn on F2, I slide my king over, and then he makes a big blunder here. He probably should play something like King F8 and just defend here, and maybe get out of that fork as well. But he plays Knight A5, and the engine says I'm just winning. I don't know why he made that move. Maybe his thought process was he sees this bishop defending F1. He wants to get the queen there for mate, so he's just attacking the bishop. But it's too slow. I attack the queen with Knight H3, a good move to be aware of. And the queen is really low on squares. My opponent played Knight F6 to counterattack, but that just allowed me queen takes G7. And so now I'm threatening the rook in the corner, and I'm threatening the queen. And he played rook G8, and I took the knight with check, forking the king and the rook, and the game was over. He resigned. All right, so that was satisfying. Let's look at some Grandmaster games. So this was a blitz game, Nakamura versus Yang Yi. It was the 2019 World Blitz Championships. So Nakamura is playing the Vienna game here. And they do play this symmetric variation, and Nakamura does get in this Queen G4. But Black doesn't go for Queen F6, the mistake we just saw. Instead, he plays G6, which isn't so great either because all those dark squares are being weakened. Nakamura doesn't want to leave his queen on this diagonal with the bishop there, so he puts it back on F3 and threatens a mate on F7. Knight F6 blocks that mate, and now Nakamura just develops. And then gets this pin here on the knight. So he starts working against these dark squares. And right away, Black cracks with a blunder, a tactical mistake. He plays H6 to get rid of that bishop. And the reason that's a mistake is because of Nakamura's nice move, Queen H4. So just piling up another attacker on the pinned knight, and Black has nothing better than to lose the exchange here. And Nakamura just traded off the pieces and went into an easily won endgame, an exchange up. So we won't look at the rest. Nakamura won that game. Let's look at another game Nakamura played. This was a game from 2013, the Norway tournament, and it was Nakamura versus Carlsen. And Chess says it was an extremely accurately played game. Something like 4 cent-a-pawn loss for each player, no inaccuracies, no mistakes, no blunders. So they do play the Vienna, and Carlsen goes for this 3 knights variation. And then D3, and Carlsen likes to go for the bishop pair here with Knight A5. Knight GE2, Bishop E7, castles, D6, and now F4. So after getting the knight to E2 and getting safely castled, that's a good time to push to F4, Nakamura says. Okay, and now Carlsen takes off the bishop pair and then plays C6, opening this diagonal for the queen. So Nakamura gets his king off of that diagonal, moves over to H1, Black castles. F5, just gaining some space and blocking out that light squared bishop. B5 is an interesting pawn sacrifice by Carlsen, and his point is this pair of pawns has a good grip on the D5 square, and so Carlsen is going to lure the C pawn off of C4 and then push to D5. And takes, and Black's compensation is the bishop pair and the strong center of pawns. And the game is about balanced according to the engine, and it did go on for 38 moves, and the game was drawn. Let's look at one more Grandmaster game. This was played in 2017, Daniel Dubov versus Tomaszewski. I think it was the Russian Championships. And Dubov plays the Vienna Game, and they play the Vienna Gambit. They play the main line with this Queen F3. Queen F3 is not the main line, but until that point it was the main line. And black exchanges knights, and Dubov decides to take back with the B pawn, and it doesn't work out so well for him. He doesn't get a good opening. Black plays c5, excellent move. Those two pawns there on c5 and d5 are very strong. Bishop b5 check, knight c6. Queen g3, he slides that queen over like we talked about, putting pressure here and supporting the center and opening up the square for the knight. Queen b6, rook b1 defending the bishop. And that bishop is pinned right now to the rook, but black can't win it with a6 because bishop takes c6 comes with check. So bishop to e6, knight f3, black castles, and now he is threatening a6. That would work, that would win material. So white pushes his rook to b2, so it's defended by a dark squared bishop. Although not a great square for the rook, unless he can eventually double rooks here on the b file, but I think black will defend just fine over there. h6, castles, queen c7, exchanges, plays d3, bishop e7, rook b3, strange looking move. Maybe he's opening the diagonal here for the bishop to come to a3. g5, black is just going to push the kingside pawns here with his king castle on the queen side. Queen f2, rook d7 defends the b7 point, and each player is pushing the pawns on the opposite wing. And white ends up doubling the rooks on the b file, but it doesn't really make any difference. Black has the position well defended. So I won't look any further. The opening is apparently a success for black here. The engine says it's negative 1.3. So you must have to look for some improvements here for white. But it was this game that inspired me to take on c3 with the D pawn rather than the B pawn as Dubov tried. All right, thanks for watching the video. I hope you learned something about the Vienna game and give it a try.